Hello, everybody, and happy Friday from sunny St. Paul. My name is Molly Glevy, and I work in the Alumni Relations Office here at Hamline. And if you notice my background, if any of you aren't in Minnesota today, that's kind of what it looks like. Kind of what it looks like. It's not maybe quite as green, but um, welcome to February. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had a great turnout for today's talk, which of course feels very timely. Where's the love? Why family-friendly public policies have been unsuccessful in the United States. I'm going to get us started this morning, give us a little bit of information, introduce our speaker, Professor Alina Oxendine, and then hand it over to her. So before we dive in, a few things about Zoom, which most of us know at this point. You'll be muted and your camera is off today. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A. If you have a question about the logistics of today's or just feel like chatting, go ahead and put something into the chat. We'll find your questions and your comments either in the Q&A or chat. So don't worry too much if you drop them into one place or the other. Professor Oxendine is going to take questions at the end of our time today. But don't feel like you have to wait to drop those in until the end. If you want to ask questions throughout, that is just fine. But we've had time at the end to pick those up. A few other things I'll mention now. We have more Leo lectures coming up this spring. We have three additional after today between now and May. You can find information about those at our hamline.edu/alumni website. All online, and you're welcome to register at any time. We also love ideas for Leo lectures. We'll keep doing these online. We'll probably bring some back on campus at some point, but we love your ideas, whether you have an idea of a Hamline speaker or a speaker that has some tie to Hamline, or you have an idea for a topic and you'd like us to go see if we can find somebody who can come in and speak about that. Please let us know. You'll get an email from me after today, but we love those ideas. And on sort of a same topic, nomination season is upon us for alumni awards. So we are looking for alums to nominate both faculty and alumni for our alumni awards. And the nomination deadline is April 1st. So we always like to make a plug wherever we can to go ahead and nominate great Hamline folks. You can find that information on our website. And with that, I am going to go ahead and introduce Alina. Move my screen. Here we go. Alina Oxendine is a professor of political science at Hamline University. She graduated summa cum laude from Emory with a bachelor's degree in international studies and completed her master's degree also at Emory in political science. Her PhD is from the University of Minnesota. She has research and teaching interests in American politics, public opinion, political psychology, economic inequality, and community engagement. She has been a visiting researcher in the politics department at the University of York and has also taught graduate coursework at the Humphrey Institute. And she also has served in numerous administrative roles here at Hamline. And with that, Alina, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me here. Right. Right, hopefully you're able to see my slides okay and hear me okay. So thanks so much, Molly, for the introduction and for organizing this with everyone else in the alumni office. I worked with Molly on a first-year seminar in 2020 of all years, and Molly was my campus colleague. And it was a challenging class to teach during the very early part of the pandemic. We definitely know each other well after that experience, and it ended up being a good one. My appreciation for organizing this and inviting me. Like Molly mentioned, I'm Professor Oxendine. I'm chair and professor in the political science department. I wanted to first shout out to all of the alums from political, if there are any in the audience from political science, who, either took classes or maybe graduated with a political science degree. So I also, in addition to my work with political science, am the high impact teaching practices co-fellow with Sarah Greenman. So we're working on that project right now. So working on a lot of different kinds of things. And my teaching and research is focused mainly on American politics at the intersection of public opinion and public policy. So I use a lot of survey research and also integrate it into my classes quite a lot too. Some of my students do some survey research with their senior capstone projects also. I work within the subfield of political psychology, and it deals heavily with the influence of social identities and attitudes associated with race, gender, and class. And so that's an area also that I teach. I have a class called political psychology that I'm actually teaching right now. And today I'm going to talk about family-friendly policies, as you can tell from the title. Given that family tends to be such a shared human experience, and usually people like kiddos pretty well, you'd think it would be a terrific contender for bipartisan support, and sometimes it is, and we'll talk about that. But still, the question often arises, why does the United States lack strong family-friendly policies compared to other countries? And even though I have a limited amount of time, I'm going to focus mainly on, I'm going to cover the national level kind of dynamics. I won't be able to get into state level policies, but I think we can do a pretty good analysis of the national level. And I'm going to be focusing a bit more on public opinion rather than institutional constraints, but we'll get into those a little bit too. And I'm going to focus mostly on the child tax credit, but I'll cover a few other examples as well, just to give a broader context for what family-friendly policies look like. And then, if you follow the political news, you may have noticed that a bipartisan bill passed in the House of Representatives just a few days ago, and it includes an expansion of the child tax credit. So we'll see what happens, and if it will get through the Senate. But it's a pretty timely conversation. So let's just start by talking about some examples of family-friendly policies. Then after that, I'll move into the factors that influence people's support or lack of support. And then I'll share some of my own research after that. And then, like Molly mentioned, at the end, I'll engage with some of your questions. Or if you even have some comments about your thoughts about some of these policies, I'd also love to see those too. So. All right, so examples of family-friendly public policies. So I'm going to highlight a few. Many of you are probably aware that most countries in the world offer some kind of paid parental leave, supporting parents' time off work to take care of new babies or newly adopted children. And actually, only about 8 countries in the world don't offer this. So the United States, being such an affluent country, is notable in being one of the few without this kind of national policy. You're probably aware that the closest thing we have is the national level Family and Medical Leave Act that provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid support for only some families. And in contrast, you can kind of think about other countries like Sweden, where it's over a year at 80% pay. So you see, such a huge difference in the way we approach it versus some other countries. So we'll get into, why we're maybe not quite as far along in developing these policies. In a related discussion, you can think about another example, which is affordable childcare opportunities or support for childcare as especially children get older. In the United States, we offer universal free education starting in kindergarten, as you're well aware. And that's usually starting, around 4 or 5, but we don't offer a lot of support at the national level before that. In contrast, other countries begin universal preschool at much earlier ages, like 1 in Denmark or 2 in Belgium or 3, I think it's in Estonia, Japan, Poland, so you see that they're kind of starting this whole system earlier, which then, of course, provides really good support for families. We actually experienced this, my family, when we were living in York, England for 6 months, when I took a group of Hamline students there to study for a semester. So shout out also to any of you who have done the York program in the past. It was a wonderful program. And also study abroad opportunities, wonderful. Our kids at the time of this, like we took them along, and they were 4 and 8, and we had our kids enrolled in public schools there, which was interesting. And they enjoyed actually. And we had our kids enrolled also in some summer childcare and after school care. And what's kind of interesting is our 4-year-old received 30 hours of free childcare a week there, and they funneled that money through the actual childcare providers. So instead of it kind of coming out or going directly to families, it kind of was funneled that way, which worked really well, actually. And it was a little shocking to be just a visitor there and receive that kind of benefit. And so I wanted to just note that. And this is another example, of course, that we'll be talking about here, the child tax credit. So another way to support families is for government to grant direct payments or tax credits to support the cost of raising children. And usually these payments offer lots of flexibility, and families are able to use the money how they see fit. And that's, a real nice thing about it. But a challenge with providing support through the tax system is that, you're well aware of this, the tax system here is quite complicated. These programs can then become kind of confusing. And then also, depending on how they're designed, lower income families that don't file or receive refunds can be left out of benefits entirely. So again, it depends on how it's designed, but that can be a real downside to these kinds of policies and approaches. So you may be aware, especially if you have kids and benefited from this, that during 2021, many families in the United States received an enhanced child tax subsidy or child tax credit, which was part of the American Rescue Plan. And, they debated extension of this program, but the negotiations weren't successful, and families are no longer receiving these enhanced payments. But like I mentioned a minute ago, now conversations are gaining momentum yet again, although what's in the bill in the House is not as robust as this one that we experienced in 2021. And so that's just something, to keep in mind. But we'll see what happens, as it goes through the Senate, if there are any changes. For the 2021 tax year, the benefits were pretty good, and a lot of people were eligible for this enhanced credit. So if you were single, and making 75,000, or if you were married and making even up to 150,000, you were eligible, and your child had to be age 17 or under. So it included a wide range of ages in terms of the types of families that were able to get this benefit. And you got more money if your kids were younger. So it was designed so that if you had kids under 6, you received for that year $3,600. And then if you had older kids, you got a little less. but it was per kid. And so it was a pretty substantial benefit during this time. So what I do when I've talked about this in my classes with my students is I ask them to kind of think about, now that, I've talked about this particular program, how supportive are you of this enhanced child tax credit? Do you think this kind of program, is kind of situated well to reduce economic or racial inequities in the United States? Why or why not? So it's just kind of interesting because I went back and dug up some of the student polling that I got from asking these questions. And I'll show you here the response from one of my classes. You can see that students were pretty supportive of this policy. The child tax credit got like strong support among Hamline students, with it looks like 39% supported it, and then about 39% strongly supported it. And it's the same thing. I mean, in the American public, it's not quite this high in terms of support, but still you have usually a majority of Americans that like this kind of program or other family-friendly policies. But what can get really tricky is when you actually have to look at how are you going to pay for this program? Also, what are some other priorities that are kind of competing in some of the, legislative discussions? You're always kind of jockeying with politics generally, but then also people have different priorities, and sometimes it can be popular but not really gain momentum for some of these other reasons, or if you just have very fierce opposition, that can kind of play a role as well. But it's just kind of interesting that generally, though, you see Hamline students pretty supportive, and then the American population also tends to be pretty supportive as well. And I'll talk more about my research on that too. And then the other question, do you think that this helps to reduce economic or racial inequities? You have a little bit more hesitation here, which I think speaks to possibly kind of like the design of the program, including so many different kinds of families, even some affluent ones with higher incomes. And that's what I gleaned from the conversation around it as well, when students shared kind of their thoughts about it. But you can see that there's kind of a lot of students here that say, well, maybe the program will work and help with these things. And then some saying 34% saying, yes, it should help. It's interesting. I mean, this is, level of poverty is a little different than looking at and assessing inequities specifically, but you see that now that we've had a few years to evaluate the effects of the program, it's encouraging to see some really promising results. So according to the Census Bureau, child poverty fell to its lowest level on record in 2021. So that's so the idea that we could maybe revisit an enhanced child tax credit is encouraging. And even though it's not as robust, we probably won't see these kinds of results. But unless maybe, who knows, like it could, become stronger in the future, better funded in the future. So we'll have to see. So it was, I mean, if you think about it, more politically viable to enact an enhanced child tax credit during the pandemic when so many families were struggling. It was just kind of a different political context. But now, it is, still, possible. We're seeing that, but it's a little more of a challenge. So it's important for us to look at and really kind of evaluate and analyze some of the reasons why people, both average citizens and political leaders, are reluctant to support the child tax credit or other family-friendly public policies. So, even though American public opinion is generally supportive of these policies, issues do arise when it comes down to, like I said before, funding, prioritizing, Garnering bipartisan support can be a political challenge. So I'm going to discuss several reasons for why we have people hesitating, because we just need to keep these in mind. And this list is by no means exhaustive. It kind of talks about some considerations, but I'm sure you're all probably going to think of some more to add to it. But we generally, as any of you have learned from taking an American government class, there's a strong preference for limited government, and that's kind of what we've seen in our political culture historically in the United States. That we have a lot of people, especially conservatives, who are, really value limited government, and also are very, concerned about taxation being too high. So that's something that I think is a consideration. And I'll talk too about how sometimes concerns about the way programs are designed can be a factor. Some people, especially if you like limited government, you might really kind of like this idea of really targeting benefits, but there can be debate about that, because more inclusive universal benefits can be better for the long term if you want to boost the viability and strength of a program. So that's why you're going to see some debate around that, and sometimes that can slow down momentum around policies, especially policies like this that we're talking about. You also have the role of self-interest. And there are people who don't have kids and don't benefit directly, or maybe their kids are older and, it's no longer as much a concern. So I think that's also a consideration. I see that also in the research that I've done and others have done. And then you still have in the United States pretty traditional attitudes about gender and family roles in, some regions and areas and among some individuals. So that's something that can be a factor. We have in the United States still some strong racial resentments that exert an influence, and not just family and influencing support for family-friendly public policies, but a lot of social programming across the board is affected by racial attitudes. And so we talk about this a lot. Those of you who have taken my political psychology class or, other classes at Hamline have talked about this, I know. But there's a lot of research on that. And then we have, I know you're aware, high levels of income inequality and economic inequality in the United States, and that exerts an influence as well. And you see that it shapes beliefs about, poverty, work, and those kinds of dynamics. And I think, like, with these disparities, you have a lot of people who are quite affluent, who are kind of not as connected to what it's like to be, a working class American, or kind of what it's like to struggle. So that kind of disparity and kind of gap that we see can play out in these policy debates. And then finally, I think it's important to mention cultural norms regarding the way we in the United States kind of approach work and family. I think we often kind of see them as kind of very separate spheres of life. And, it doesn't necessarily need to be all only up to individuals and families to deal with these problems. And in other countries, the idea that government would be more involved makes sense to people. And also there can sometimes not be quite as much a dichotomy between our work lives and family lives. But we kind of, I think in this country, separate them out a little bit more. And also kind of assume that, families are going to kind of take care of it on their own a bit more. So again, it's kind of just a cultural norm, or what we actually have been contending with historically. So Now I want to talk about a few debates that are related to the first few points from my last slide. And these are questions about, first, should government intervene at all? And so that kind of speaks to that point about how historically we have a culture of a real preference for a limited government for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people feel this way, that there's some value in just limiting government. And then there's another question about program design. If government does get involved, should programs be more inclusive and universal, or should they be means tested and more targeted? And so I want to talk about that a bit as well. But first, I'm going to just talk about that point about intervention, because there is just some really fascinating research on this, which is really interesting and related to the economic inequality that I just mentioned as well. So some people, like we talked about, are quite opposed to government intervening. And then with widening inequality, what we're finding in the research is that this growing inequality might be actually making this reluctance even stronger. And so part of the issue is that growing disparities make it really challenging, like I said before, for affluent Americans to fully understand, what it's like to be, working class or struggling a bit more. And another factor, though, is that inequality itself fuels polarization and gridlock, which further harms Americans' trust and confidence in government to effectively handle any challenges or problems. So you can kind of see how this kind of starts to create a bit of a vicious cycle, because if you have these challenges of, let's say, growing inequality, but then people are reacting by losing confidence in government, you don't really have other ways to address the problem other than government intervening. It's not the case that historically corporate intervention has really helped, economic disparities. So really it's up to government, but with the lack of the growing distrust or lack of confidence, it creates quite a challenging problem. And then another big question that I mentioned is about how to best design these programs. And so this is really kind of the difference between, some of the, main approaches. You can approach policies by making them means tested, where a person just gets a benefit or family gets a benefit if they make below a certain level of income, or so there's some sort of income threshold. Or you can go about designing a program so that's more universal, where everyone gets the benefit, regardless of income. And so like you think about like public education, that's something that like, everybody's eligible. And you don't have to necessarily, be, challenged economically to take advantage of that. So we, in an interesting way, I think, when you look at public opinion data, people often have a preference for more targeted programs. And that makes sense. Like, I think, if you just like think of it just intuitively, like you want to be efficient and target the people who need it. So I think people are very likely to choose this. But it's actually much more complicated when you start to think about the long-term implications of more targeted approaches. So usually programs that benefit more people are more inclusive tend to become more politically popular. So you kind of think about like the popularity of Social Security. It's a pretty popular program, partly because it's more universal in the way it's designed, and a lot of people are, included in it. It makes it more politically popular and robust. And so it's kind of a balancing act, really, because you want to be efficient, but at the same time, it tends to work better to aim for inclusivity, because the programs themselves tend to have more staying power, stronger financial support, And even in just thinking about different family-friendly policies, the child tax credit benefits, if you think about it, a wider range of families at any given time, because families with kids of all ages are going to be, benefiting compared to like parental leave or childcare policies, which benefit parents of more kind of young children primarily. So even like as a political strategist, you can see why the child tax credit might have more political traction and success compared to some of these other family-friendly policies, and why designing the program to be more inclusive could be beneficial. So that's just something to think about. Now, another factor, which is kind of interesting, is gender and gender norms, which can be important and also make parental leave and childcare policies a little more difficult to navigate in a political sense. So for some Americans, they don't want government to support both parents being in the workforce because of those more traditional attitudes about kind of like family roles and how families should work. And so if you think about it, a broader policy like the child tax credit avoids forcing value judgment about whether both parents should or would work or not. So that's just kind of another kind of interesting kind of strategic, consideration when you kind of think about like which types of family-friendly policies might, again, be kind of more successful or popular. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my own research, which sheds some light on the role of racial resentments and the role of social class in particular. So, I published an article in this book called Race, Gender, Class, Media last year. And the piece is called Who Deserves a Break? How Race and Class Shape Support for the Child Tax Credit. And so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about that. But, if you want to read more, you can feel free to contact me and I can send you a copy of the article. It's pretty easy to read. It's short and it kind of goes into more detail than I'm going to be able to provide. But what I wanted to do with the research is kind of use the opportunity for the near universality of the enhanced child tax credit to ask these kinds of questions, which is, do you see race or class shape Americans' perceptions of whether recipient families are deserving of the child tax credit? And then with so many different types of families eligible, does it matter which ones are highlighted in the media? Because around the time that I did this research, it was kind of interesting because there were many news stories highlighting how families had been benefiting from this enhanced credit. And some of the pieces were really good about kind of highlighting families in different situations and then how they were using the money. And so I was like, oh, I wonder if, these kind of the framing of these stories impacts kind of how people view the program in a general sense. And so I conducted this study. It was in 2022, so still kind of in the middle of the pandemic. And there were a lot of news stories at the time about how they were going to kind of not have the enhanced child tax credit in the same way. And so that was kind of a discussion at the time. And I surveyed 700 Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, which you're kind of like, what is that? But MTurk is what it's called for short. It's a crowdsourcing platform on which you can pay people to take surveys. And it usually captures a pretty wide diversity of survey respondents. And I, in some of my senior capstone classes and even political research classes, we can collect some data on using MTurk. And it's a pretty fast way to collect this data. Sometimes it kind of depends, but the quality of data is not going to be as strong as like a nationally representative sample that you might get off of, like through YouGov or some sort of organization like this, but it's still, pretty interesting, good quality data if you include attention checks and things, and also sift through the data. And it captures a wide diversity of, characteristics of people. Again, not quite like a nationally representative sample, but still wide variety of characteristics. And this data collection happened right around the time, like I said, that the child tax credit had been discontinued. So there was a lot of conversation about that. And so about like when you look at just kind of the data that I collected about support for the child tax credit at that time, about 66% of people reported that they either supported or strongly supported the policy. And that was a little higher than nationally representative samples at the time or around that time. And that makes sense because MTurk workers tend to be a little more liberal, a little younger than the average public. So that wasn't surprising. I was curious about questions like, what kinds of characteristics predicted the most support for the child tax credit. And so you can kind of think about like, what would you guess would predict support for the policy? And what I found was that the most influential factors were number of kids in the respondent's household. Of course, yes, self-interest there, right? And so that was a pretty, not a surprise to me. Liberal ideology also predicted support. Party identification with the Democratic Party. And what was interesting was other characteristics like income, race, gender, age, and education were not statistically significant. So it was mainly those other factors: number of kids, ideology, and party ID. So that was interesting. But another part of my study was that I wanted to look at different types of families benefiting, and I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to test whether program support might be affected by how the media depicts, families receiving these payments. And specifically, do you see race or class shaping Americans' perceptions of whether recipient families are deserving of the child tax credit? And so I used a controlled pre-test, post-test survey experiment, which allowed me to measure whether and to what extent recipient characteristics mattered. And these are the different types of families featured in my experimental conditions. And so you can see I had, race and class were varying across the different conditions. Respondents answered a set of pre-test survey questions, and then they read a news article, which was one of 7 versions that were assigned randomly. And then they completed a set of post-test questions. And then the pre-test and post-test included items evaluating support for the child tax credit. And in between the pre-test and post-test, they read a news article called "What the End of the Child Tax Credit Means for Families," which I kind of used real media stories as inspiration, but I created the story so that it would work for this experiment. And across the different conditions, I kept everything the same except for race and class. And there was also a control condition, which was a story about an archaeological excavation, so completely different. And that was just to test kind of what happens if you don't give the respondents any information about the child tax credit. So a few pictures here are from the upper class Black and white conditions. So the upper class condition presents facts about the child tax credit and then talks about an affluent family with young kids, and the parents are running their own small business, and they took a hit during the pandemic, but they are still financially stable. And they use the payments to cover childcare, renovate their kitchen, and put some money back into their family business. And the working class condition presents facts about the child tax credit too, but then discusses a family struggling with unemployment. And in this condition, the family uses the child tax credit to cover the cost of preschool. They don't really have enough to cover preschool for one child. So it kind of talks about that and talks about some extracurriculars that they cover. I made sure to keep the articles as similar as possible, except for race and class. And so that was what I was trying to do with the experiment. And then this just shows you some of the results here. So you can see that the largest increase in support for the tax credit was in the group that read about the Latinx working class family. And the smallest increase was the group that read about the white affluent family. And even though all of the respondents became more supportive of the child tax credit after reading the news articles, you didn't really see a significant difference when comparing the working class and affluent conditions. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then you see a difference in terms of like the intersection of race and class, because respondents reading about white or Latinx families, they exhibited more support for the tax credit when reading about working class families, as opposed to affluent. But then that pattern is reversed for respondents reading about the Black families, and then they were more supportive of the affluent families, or the child tax credit after reading about the affluent family as opposed to the working class family. So interesting things there with race and class. And then there were I collected some qualitative data about people's reactions, like if you ask them, whether this family was deserving, and just in general, and you can, if you want to, read more in my article, but what I thought was interesting was not the majority were not this judgmental, but there were a lot of people who were judgmental, especially of the working class Black and Latinx families, and really kind of nitpicked how they were using that money. I mean, you can see here in the quote, if you can't afford preschool or extracurricular activities, then you should no longer do these. They're really kind of like almost micromanaging, what they should be doing with these funds, which was interesting to kind of think about, like, how the influence of media in kind of thinking about policies that are more generous and allow this kind of flexibility, and then how it can kind of backfire in some ways, depending on kind of how it's depicted and then how it's interpreted by people. And then another quote, I'm not getting 300 per month for doing nothing, neither should they. So, also in this, you're kind of seeing some of the individualism, I think, in the United States, kind of this idea, not that we're kind of in it together, but more kind of like, well, if I'm not getting it, then they shouldn't get it. So that was just kind of interesting. So in terms of my conclusions, biases around race, class, gender are still, powerful. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest takeaways. But also, I think our policies we need to consider making them more universal due to the evidence of racial resentments and self-interest that you see. And I think that inclusivity tends to be more effective in reducing stigmatization of beneficiaries, and they tend to be more, kind of like better funded overall, more successful overall. And we also, of course, need to work on reducing these biases, and then being strategic and considering them also if we want to get some of these policies passed. And then we need to remember too that programs often generate their own momentum and popularity once they're in place. So that's something to also consider. And then just to say a few words here, like if you're a student, some of you are students or students And we have a lot of classes that you can take to learn more about this. So we've integrated a lot more public policy coursework into our curriculum. And so these are just a few classes that you might consider. And then in terms of the political science major, at the undergraduate level, we have thematic tracks that kind of help to prepare students for specific roles after graduation. So political change and advocacy, you might want to focus on that if you want to do campaign management or nonprofit work for a nonprofit. Public service law and leadership is great for students who want to go into public service or maybe go into law school. And then you have international and regional security for students with more of a global politics interest and maybe more interested in things like diplomacy or conflict resolution. And we have a new program, public policy. It's a concentration that's interdisciplinary, and you can pair it with a lot of different majors. And so it's very exciting, and we have a lot of interested students who are signing up for this, but you have, the possibility of pursuing this public policy concentration in a wide variety of majors, from, environmental studies to public health, criminology, criminal justice, econ, legal studies. So like a lot of cool things going on. And then contact me if you have any questions or want more information. I have a few websites here if you're interested, but I'm happy to share more information if that would be helpful, or even a copy of the article that I've been talking about. So that's pretty much what I have. And so I want to answer any questions that you have. And I'm going to look here at the Q&A, but I might want to look at the chat too. All right. All right. I'm also open to kind of hearing about any comments you have. And
Alina, there's a question in the
yeah.
chat, if you can see that.
Okay, yeah, I think so. There's one after. Oh, okay. One person asks for a PDF. I'm going to share that with Molly. So yes, there will be a PDF available. There's also a question here. How does the phenomenon described by McGee and the sum of the US intersect with these policies? And I would have to look at this McGee, the sum of the US, or hear more about that before I would be able to talk about that. So I'm not sure about the answer to that one. So are there any other questions
There
or
are
comments even?
in the
Okay.
Q&A, there's some questions coming in.
Okay.
Want to hop over there?
Okay, it looks like the MPA program in its early days focused on state and local government operations. Do you still offer this? So I'm not in the graduate level programming, and I'm not sure exactly what kinds of classes are offered through the business school. They have a really good program on leadership and public administration, but I'm not exactly sure if this specific class, state and local government, is offered. We, at the undergraduate level, I think the closest thing would be politics of urban and metropolitan America, which we still offer. I don't remember the last time we offered a state and local politics. That's a very common class to offer. And again, it kind of overlaps with that urban and metro class. And we have talked about maybe offering it, and it could be maybe like a special topics in the future, because I think it would be a really good support to our major and the public policy program. So I think those are probably the most related. Let's see here. Universal programs could be easier to get approved, but would that be equitable? That's an excellent question. And I think, yeah, it is kind of like I mentioned kind of before, a balancing act. It is true that often you have people who are more affluent who would then be, receiving benefits, but you have to kind of look at that alongside of the fact that these programs, if they're designed in a universal manner, will probably in the long run be better funded. And so then you have more benefits actually funneling to people who do need them. And then it kind of comes down to whether or not those at the very high end of the income distribution are then benefiting so much that it's not able to bridge gaps. Usually that's not the case. I mean, usually universal programs are pretty effective at kind of minimizing inequities. But I kind of depend, like you kind of have to look program to program because the devil can be, in the details. All right. But generally, I think researchers would say that universal programs are still pretty effective. And can be quite, powerful in reducing poverty, but also inequality. Let's see. Do you think do you think better marketing of these types of programs would have a notable impact on public acceptance of them? That's also a really good question. I think, sure. I mean, I think marketing them could definitely be helpful, but even in a broader sense of helping to boost civic education generally, and helping people to understand the good that government can do to kind of help to balance out. Of course, we want to be critical of government also, but sometimes the strength of kind of negativity in media around government can outweigh, and we start to take for granted a lot of the benefits we receive from policies and government programming. So it's kind of like I agree, yeah, marketing could be really helpful, but I think we almost need kind of more kind of civic education in a much broader sense. And so I'm going to just look at time here. Okay, I think I've got maybe a few minutes and then I'll pass the torch back to Molly. So do you think that these policies might come up in the general election campaign? Oh, that's a really good question too. If so, how might that potentially help or hurt the efforts around these policies? So what's kind of interesting right now is that some of the debate is being kind of like a lot of attention is going to debates about immigration policy. And then there was some speculation. I think this was in the NPR story that was run yesterday, that I think it's kind of people have been a little distracted by the immigration policy kind of discussion and not focused as much on the child tax, credit in the bill. And I think Trump in particular has been very outspoken about other kinds of policies, but hasn't been as oppositional about this. And so I don't know, we'll see if that kind of continues. It, may be a more difficult policy to kind of target and criticize. And in that way, it might be something that could be I don't know, maybe more useful for Democrats to kind of talk about, but maybe a little bit harder for Republicans to go after. And so that would be my guess about how it might play out. But we'll see. It'll be interesting. And it's really exciting that it's so timely right now and may actually be enacted again, and those benefits boosted for families in the United States. All right, so I think we have 3 minutes left. Molly, do you want me to pass the torch back at this point?
Yeah, or actually, there's one question here that we might have time for. Do you think universal programs are easier to administer and allow money to be used more effectively with less overhead to manage? Example, your York example.
Yeah, right. I think that is an excellent point. And another factor, because yeah, they can be easier to manage in the sense that you're not having to focus as much on who's eligible, who's not eligible, and then in essence, policing that can be a real difficult thing to, administer. And so, yeah, universal programs, if designed effectively, can actually be easier to administer for that reason. So, yeah, I think that's a really, and then, yeah, like you mentioned the York, they say, for example, your York example, with that also thinking of ways to make the distribution of benefits more effective. I think funneling funds through childcare providers is a really good example of that, given that then they're dealing with so many different families. So rather than having all those families try to figure it out, those providers are able to do it kind of for everyone. And so it really makes it simpler and easier to administer in that way. So yeah, I think that was a really good point.
So we're not able to get to everybody's questions here. There's one that popped up that's more of a comment that I'm just going to mention out loud because I think it might be something that pops up in some of the additional resources that you mentioned, Alina, more on the long-term consequences of not supporting families. And I suspect that some of the information that you provide at the end here and in the slides may get at that, the multi-layered consequences to family and society for not supporting families. So we've got a couple more questions that we won't have time to get to, but I want you to know that we have these questions recorded as well. And I would be happy to pass them along to Alina, who's mentioned that she's willing to field questions after. So there's a few here that I'll drop and make sure that Alina gets. And like we've mentioned, we'll send out the slides that were prepared. And also this recording will live on our website as well, so folks can access it. Before I do my super formal thank yous, Alina, is there anything else you want to mention or add?
No, just thank you for having me, and your questions and comments were terrific. So thank you for those.
So yeah, thank you, Alina. Thanks everybody for participating. The next one is either Thursday or Friday, the first week in March. I should remember offhand, but you can find it in our website and I'll drop it in an email to all of you with these slides. So thank you again. If you're in St. Paul, go out and enjoy the sunshine. It's still sunny and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much. Bye, Alina.